Good afternoon. Hello, everybody. Hope that you are all
Hey,
doing as
Christian.
well as you can. Christian, good to see you. Um,
Hello, Christian.
so my name is Enoma Osakwe, and I'm joined here today with Blessing, if you want to give everybody a shout.
Hey everyone, Blessing Richardson.
Mhm. And then we've got some really cool friends who are going to be chatting with us on Hacker Hour today. So Bill and Doug, if you would like to also give everyone a shout.
Hey there. Welcome.
Hello.
Good to be here. Good to be alive.
Mhm. It is, isn't it? Okay, so we are going to have a lot more fun than we usually do today. I'm convinced of it because our topic of discussion is the idea of file over app. For anyone who hasn't, previously heard this language before, you may have already run into the concept, however. So file over app is a provocative label, a philosophy that talks about the value of having files and not just living in apps or platforms, especially as it relates to our information and our data. So we're going to have a riveting conversation and do our best to keep it within the hour. And to kick things off, I'm posing a question to our guests, Bill and Doug. And that is, what are the risks of relying on one singular platform for all of your data and all of your work, especially in business?
Go
I'll
first.
let Doug go. He's got age over beauty here.
People think their app could go away. Yes, it could, but the whole system could go away. The hardware vendor can go away. I've had whole hardware vendors disappear, and they had their own proprietary file system, and now you got to get out of there. And the other thing I think people don't understand is it can take a long time to switch vendors and software apps or whatever it is you have to do. So you have to know where the lifeboat at least is and how you might get into it in case you need it. Because the idea is, if you don't like something, you can switch platforms. Well, yeah, maybe. But if they announce tomorrow they're going out of business in 3 to 6 months, you may discover getting out of there is much harder than you thought because you have to select a new app and learn it and then learn how to get your stuff out of the old one. And as Enoma was just discussing, sometimes even a package you know and love well is impossible to get the stuff out of.
Yeah.
I find the bit about the learning, the new platform, to be something that is often underestimated.
Oh yeah.
And I think on the IT side, we look at all the things with the data migration, the systems, all those things, right? And then you're left with an organization, particularly if you're at one where you're not really tech or tech adjacent. The time that I see for change management to happen is usually about a quarter, if not 2 quarters, to get everyone into a new system and using it to some degree of proficiency as they were before, even compared to not having one. And so that, to your point, yes, somebody can come and say, oh gosh, what was the latest scandal with Bench, right? That we watched over the holidays. And all of a sudden, your accounting and your financing processes in your business, or how you manage your taxes and accountant and all that stuff and working with vendors, yada, yada, got thrown up in the air when Bench was like, we're shutting down. And then they came back and said, kidding, we got bought. And it was not great. But that's definitely one example of where those tools can disappear and it will throw you into a lurch if you're wholly dependent with at least without a plan, or, to deal with what happens if it goes away.
And anything that doesn't work right will now be your fault. And the users, as they learn this, if they didn't like something before, they won't like it now, and now it'll be your fault.
Bill, I want to kick this over to you because, and I'm going to brag on you a little bit. You've been in the game for a while now. I think the first time I saw you commenting in community forums was maybe late 2018, early 2019 in the Airtable community forums. You already bring a wealth of knowledge and experience from traditional software development, desktop development. And now you are very proficient in a range of online tooling as well. So what is your take on relying on a single platform? Is there one singular platform you would say you even trust? And if not, what should we do?
Thanks for the history of that too. I had forgotten a lot of the things you just said. partly because I'm old.
Experience.
Yeah, experience, wisdom, we can call it all kinds of things. But at the end of the day, I'm in cognitive decline. There's no doubt about it. At 72 years old, it's not getting better. But I do have a sense that there's a certain audience of people who subject themselves to these tools with the understanding that learning a new one is fun. And so there is always this little bias sitting on my shoulder saying, I'm really tired of the way I've been doing this. Maybe there's a better way. And so I think many of us, we seek out trouble. We seek out the troubled waters. We look for ways that we can piss away an entire weekend and then just look back and call it a brain fart. Now, I mean, at the end of the day, we are human, and that is another way of saying we're often stupid, right? We don't make rational decisions all the time, despite the fact that economists believe they've got us figured out. They don't. We're irrational. We have many irrational moments. But at the end of the day, I think that this intense dependency on SaaS, intense dependency on cloud is beneficial to a point. And usually that point is when it's not beneficial. And by definition, that point is when disruption occurs. And disruption usually comes without warning. And so you end up in the lifeboat situation, as Doug pointed out. Now, there are immense benefits to SaaS. None of us can debate that and argue against it. But there's some kind of middle ground in there where we have to be rational about the sustenance of any SaaS we choose. So what's the right way to create a bridge between the idea that someday Coda will save my last utterance, my last breath, if you will? Hopefully I won't, die before that happens. I'll get to see the last sentence I type in Coda. But there's a probability that there will be a last sentence that I type in Coda. I'm 72, so maybe I can make it to 80 and still be working. Will Coda still be around in 8 years? The probability is good, but it's not certain. And so any other SaaS tool that you're kind of basing your world on, your business, your enterprise, and all the other users, that follow your lead, which is another whole dimension. I'm glad you guys brought that up. I think Blessing brought that up. That's a huge risk as well, because it's not just you and your whims about trying to bridge, two SaaS worlds in order to keep, your own lights on. It's everybody else who's relying on you and who has followed your lead and listened to your counsel. So yeah, this is not so much about waging a war against SaaS as it is about bridging SaaS in some way that makes you completely independent of disruption, if you will.
Okay, but what if
a quick comment?
Yeah.
The assumption we all live on with SaaS and all this is that these systems, physical systems, wireless, et cetera, will work. When I was doing those fraud investigations, we flew all over the world, and Fearless Leader insisted on using an iPad for everything he wanted to do. Well, surprise, we get onto Cathay Pacific for a 14-hour flight. There's no Wi-Fi. And he couldn't do any of the work he had planned to do because everything lived up on a Wi-Fi based system. And so he basically scarfed off my computer, which had everything on the laptop, and he could at least get at the files. But I don't think people really, I saw some kid on a train the other day go crazy when he discovered there's no Wi-Fi on the train and he couldn't talk to his friends. Well, fine. But just think about how dependent you are on all the systems we think are here all the time. One good hurricane and there's no Wi-Fi for a week and a half and you're off the air and you can't power your device. I'll shut up.
Yeah, and that's changing. There was a time when, just LTE was not pervasive in America. and there's still places where it isn't. I use Starlink because I travel in areas where there's no connectivity at all, and I just take a satellite dish everywhere I go, and so I'm kind of impervious to those internet connection problems. But you can't hang a Starlink dish outside the window on a Cathay Pacific flight. They frown on that. I haven't tried it, but I'm pretty sure they frown on it. But at the end of the day, of course, Elon's probably going to put Starlink on the Cathay Pacific 747, so you'll see pervasive, connection, and that will only endear us more to this idea that we can be dependent on these SaaS solutions, and everything will feel good, but they won't necessarily be good. They'll just feel good.
Well, and I'm certain that there's going to be a group of people, myself, formerly included, that would say, maybe this is just an anti-progressive way of thinking about the world, right? There was a time where computers weren't required to do work, and now every workplace has an IT budget, and everybody has a personal computer and a professional computer. Are we maybe just so rooted in the past that we don't understand how the future is going? Why files? And why is that the future, not the past?
I will say, before y'all answer this, because I want you to think about this bit. I was thinking about this before our talk, and I realized that I think teams and the existence of teams working together will always demand centralization, right? And so if we are seeing the necessity for files, or essentially keeping my work on my workstation so I can keep working on it, how does that play into it? To Enoma's point, are we just fighting the inevitable and this is the way it is, or how do we take that into account? Because it's the personal workflow and then there's the team workflow.
Yeah, that's a really good point. There are ways to mimic centralization while actually storing everything in a decentralized fashion. So, Web3 is a good example. The IPFS, interplanetary file system, is a good example of how you decentralize everything, but at the same time centralize it. And so why files? Well, IPFS works with files. So, it's kind of like, here's a perfect peer-to-peer model that is sustainable, and it's very robust, and it's very reliable, and it gives you the ability to both synthesize the centralization as well as actually architect it in a decentralized fashion. By the way, I'm not suggesting that everybody jump on IPFS. I'm just saying that that's one avenue that seems to be emerging that would help us, understand how to work like teams, but actually possess all of our files individually and contribute them, through those relationships. But then going to the deeper part of why files, we say file over app, or I say file over app, because it's really easy to say, it's easy to remember, and it has this conceptual understanding that it's a file on a drive somewhere in your possession, right? So you have some sort of control over this file, as opposed to this dependency on a SaaS environment to manage that information. But it's really more than file. It's really, the better way to think about it is blob, because it could be collections of files that act as an array of data, or an actual database. So we don't want to get, kind of roped into the idea that we're really just talking about files versus an app. It's files versus Coda. Now, it's not really it. That's the philosophical tag name for it. It's kind of a bigger, more complex thing that has to do with information, that you possess, and you possess it in many different ways, files among some of them, right?
Yeah.
We have a question from Christian in the chat here, and he mentioned that several times in my career, I lost a lot of data and it never was a huge problem, although it felt like a big deal in the moment. So do we overestimate the necessity of a lot of stuff that we're doing?
That's a good question. I'll take a quick stab. Here's how to answer that. Just delete everything today, and then we'll talk tomorrow.
Now,
Delete it all. Delete everything.
well, but okay, I like that. I like that because it kind of is the Marie Kondo minimalist approach. And even as I've tried to look at my stores of data, I have a terabyte hard drive that died on me maybe about 2 years ago, and I have been meaning to get the disk, the actual data off of it and see what I want to take. But it has not interrupted or disrupted my life at
There you
all.
go. Yeah.
It is the only place I stored all of the audio files I have previously purchased in my life that is not in the cloud somewhere. So I will keep this data for the day that comes, the reckoning, where all of our subscription access to music and videos renders us not able to see the ones we want. But I think that we do have a gluttony of data, particularly in the Western world and in our quote first world countries. I say quote because I mean, what's the difference between all of them anyways? We produce so much of the data. We are responsible for everything sitting on servers around the world. And a lot of it is archaic. I would say it's about proximity. I need the data that my business is producing within the last 12, maybe even 18 to 24 months. I do. But I have rot now. My business is 5 going on 6 years old. Every proposal I ever sent my first year of business is obsolete now because I don't even offer those services and I don't offer them at that price. I won't reference that information. So data does have a life cycle. And I think that that's the difference. Something that is proximate to me, I do need, and that is important. And I do need systems to allow me to move it, but not something old.
Yeah. I could throw out a debate on that and say, all of your old data, the things that you don't offer, the services, et cetera, if you handed that to an AI and then asked it, where will I be in 5 years? It could use the old data to project where you're heading. And you might not like the heading, the compass heading. So sometimes old, seemingly worthless data could in fact be valuable in some cases. But I had a co-founder years ago. You guys all remember Inbox Zero, right? The big fad of Inbox Zero, right? And so he and I were debating about Inbox Zero and how to manage it and things like that, only because, I think I coined a phrase a long time ago, email is where knowledge goes to die. And that kind of sits well with a lot of people. It haunts me from time to time. But at the end of the day, he said, well, I can do Inbox Zero. And he had a problem because he had an inbox that had, 50,000 messages in it. And I said, yeah, you can't work like that. You got to figure out a way around that. And he said, great. And he deleted the entire inbox.
Yep.
And he said, there, now I'm Inbox Zero. And I said, yeah, but isn't there something important in there? And he said, well, if it's important, it'll find me again. And so maybe the right approach, Christian, is just say, no, let's not get so frothy about this data archive and historical perspective. Let's simply move ahead. And if it really needs to find us, it'll find us again.
So,
Well, okay.
I was going to say, since we're talking about data and files, maybe from the cloud perspective, if I'm like a Notion or an Airtable or Coda user, right? My data lives in these canvases or documents or tables and rows. And so from that perspective, what's the recourse? Let's say if I do have my CRM in a Coda document, if I have my projects mapped out in different Notion databases and pages, like what's the real recourse there?
Huge. Doug, you want to take a stab at that one?
You better have plenty of time to figure out how to replicate what you did in Notion in your new app, figure out how the new app works, and then start to move the stuff over and hope you can do it. And it may turn out that the new system doesn't work quite the same way as we see in comments from people coming to Coda from Notion, and they have to refigure how it's going to work. And that might take a little more time than they think. And that's my big concern with this sort of, for lack of a better word, innocence among many of our users that, well, it'll all just work. and it'll all be ready by tomorrow. And if something goes wrong, it'll be easy to fix and I'll just go do it. It doesn't work like that.
So then how does it work? How can it work?
I think first, I mean, we were joking beforehand about when's the last time anybody backed up. I mean, I have users who, what do you mean back up? Why would we do that? Doesn't IT do that for me? Or they lose their phone and they suddenly discover everything in their life is on their phone, and Apple, it turns out, will download everything from the universe onto your new phone, which sort of surprised me. Far more was backed up than I'd ever realized. That happened to a guy. I dove into a swimming pool with my phone on. It was not a good move. Anyway,
Not going to do that again,
I
right?
think the real point, and I think Bill's comment is so good, is you have to at least be thinking about what you would do. How would you do this? What would happen? Most people know what they do if their computer broke. They go get a new one and download stuff, hopefully from space, if it's up there. But if all their email was on their system and all taken off the servers when they read it, they've just lost all their email unless they did a backup. That kind of, they don't, the new users don't think this way.
But like,
I'm an old user, and even I had a situation where my phone got stolen and I got a replacement, and I was surprised by which apps and services did a great and awful job of actually syncing over information. Spoiler alert, Google Backups, worthless. You might as well just skip over it, not even worth it. I know what you're thinking. Well, did you do a Google backup on an Apple phone? No, I have an Android. I've had an Android. Google, terrible. But it does kind of, I didn't have any issues downloading the Notion app and opening up all of the Notion information. And I didn't have any issues with my Coda app, all of the data that was in the cloud. It was super easy, super smooth for me to just download the app and then keep things moving like nothing ever happened. So I think that there's some nuance.
What you just said, though, actually is really intriguing, because the apps that worked well were the apps that were cloud native. Like the data was in the cloud anyways, right? And you got a new device. The device, the data on your Android, which is file bound or hardware bound, right? A lot of it, that sucked. And you couldn't get it all back.
No.
So
Samsung came to save me.
Making an argument for the opposite thing here, where we do like cloud, and then maybe be careful about what you expect from what's on your hard drives.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say it that way, Blessing. I would say the cloud saved me because the cloud had a distributed way of storing my data. So Google failed, but Samsung didn't. And when Samsung wrote over the awful backup from Google, I now suddenly had almost all of my call and text history up until maybe 2 hours before my phone was stolen. So I think cloud and like files, apps, files, they work together. But it comes back to what Bill and Doug are talking about. What is the system? I never cared much about how often my phone was backing up, or whether or not it was Samsung or Apple or whomever and their mother who wanted to help me do the backups. I just assumed it would all work. I never thought about it. And I'm an IT manager. I build systems for my clients all the time. And for the first time, I sat down and said, I actually have to be methodical about what goes where and whose job it is to make it so that I can get it back in the future. And I did actually pause and think, this would have just been easier if I just backed up my phone to my desktop. My phone sits on a holster stand, you know what I'm talking about, on my desk every day. I could very well just have a backup system that runs to a hard drive, and it would have been cheaper and less traumatic to get all my data out of it. But it's really just, we can have good systems whether we have files or whether we have apps. We need the system anyways.
Yeah, and I think it's important to realize that there's two types of risks here, right? There's the risk that a device and or cloud service fails, and you're kind of left holding the bag and the bag is empty. Or a different scenario is a cloud service evaporates. And I think file over app, at least from a philosophical standpoint, I tend to look at the latter. All of these, services that we buy that are fundamentally cloud driven or cloud enabled, they're not going to go away. and we can gain great benefit from them. But the scenario where a disruption, perhaps temporary or permanent, that is a scenario where we don't give enough attention to the detail. And by detail, I mean we don't insulate ourselves from the inevitable. It's inevitable that there will be disruptions, and it's inevitable that every product that we use today will no longer exist. And that's the thing we can't seem to internalize in our minds. Most of us, we think that, Facebook is going to be around forever. We don't have to worry about it. The reality is it's not. Someday it's going to go away. And
So don't tell Zuckerberg that.
well, any dependency that you make on Facebook or anybody else, any other system, is a place where insulation should exist, right? So if you have some kind of strategic or even tactical dependency on information, those are the places where you should look for potential insulation. And insulation is really hard to come by. There's not a lot of good ways to do it. I mean, I have a team of 7 people on Coda. They're all, PhD AI people that are producing amazing work. And Coda is their backplane, their canvas for documentation and hypotheses, and even all of our AI testing facilities are in Coda. If Coda collapsed tomorrow, we have a plan, and the plan is quite simple. There's a collection of Google app scripts that are running in our Google account that are constantly probing the API for new information. And that API in Coda is the gateway to running a collection of files and other data systems that exist again in a cloud, but they're not in Coda's cloud, right?
Right.
So our workers are free to also instantiate those in a file, an actual instantiation on their laptops, etc. But at the end of the day, that is our only insulation. And if we did not have that, it would be tough to sleep at night, I think, because we all know that Coda, it's a pretty good company. It's probably funded well enough to sustain itself, for at least the near term, 5 years, whatever. But will it be around forever? Probably not. And there's others that are in the same boat. So those are the two areas. Phones are one thing. Other cloud services that they're maybe not strategic in nature, they might be tactical. But then the other side of that is a dependency on anything that could disrupt your business. That's a whole nother ball of yarn.
Nick brought up something really good to call out here, and he said that he sees 2 questions: the integrity of business data, that's in the event that someone in the cloud screws up, and it disappears, and the reliability and resilience of your own processes, right? And I think we have a lot more control over our own processes than we do over a third party managing that data and their own processes, essentially, about data backup, recovery, and restoration. And so I think, to your point, Bill, thinking about the backup is so important. I think this is an example that parlays to anybody in business who's doing any kind of marketing. So if y'all are on social media at all, or you happen to go in whenever Instagram goes down, Facebook goes down, something at AWS, which they are so slow at updating their status pages, that's a different conversation, but something in AWS goes down, you realize that people are freaking out, right? And at some point, people in the digital marketing realm, because I see a lot of that, some of them are my clients or just people I follow, there is this conversation about own your business, own your data. And it kind of joggles my mind, because ownership, we talk about owning your data, have your website and have an email list. But at the end of the day, my brain goes, what are the processes that you have in place to make that real? Because if you say that, social media, Instagram is rented land for your marketing, that's awesome. And then you give people a newsletter to sign up and give them your email. Okay, well, now you have their emails, but that's now in MailChimp. It's in ConvertKit or Kit. It's in Flowdesk. It's in some, ActiveCampaign. It's in some other cloud tool, right? And from all the different, projects that I think most of us get, I don't have any fingers to count on how many times somebody came to me specifically and said, build a system so that I actually retain my data and own it, right? It is migrated into yet another cloud system. So replicate it. So that way I feel like I have it and there's redundancy, but there's not real ownership in that I have my raw data. So when it comes to processes, and I think about it, just in the case of email, some things I would put in place for my own business is that any tool that I have that collects any kind of email contact information, it's going to go to a Google Sheet for now, because that's as much as I would love to play with another SQL database in my life. When it comes to business data, a spreadsheet is easy, right? And so let's put it in a spreadsheet. And then that spreadsheet can be exported to a CSV. And when Google Drive sync, right, now I have it downloading to my desktop. And I use a fun app called Hazel for Mac that lets you run file automations. And so I'm using it in certain ways that say, when CSVs drop into this folder, back it up and move it here. Since I have an S3 account, I can even say, hey, when it shows up, this type of file shows up in this folder, I do want you to take it and export it into S3, right? But if people aren't actually looking at their processes and saying, where's my data really live? Where's the source for my data? Am I making sure that all certain types of data go to one point, right? So I use Lemon Squeezy to sell digital products. I've used ConvertKit has its own way of collecting emails to sell digital products, right? I have direct Stripe payment links. So, my digital footprint for e-commerce is spreading here. If I have all these storefronts, all these booths into my business, where is the back-end system that's logging those transactions? If there's not one point, the source of truth or the place of record, right?
That's a really good point that you raise. And I was kind of reflecting back to my original comment about insulation. We look at, I'm not a big fan, as probably most of you know, concerning these glue factories, things like, Make and Zapier. Those are environments that tend to create bad habits, but they can also be really valuable. And so I might just throw out a comment here that it's kind of obvious that those infrastructures are really, they're not used enough to play a role in file over app. The file over app philosophy that says, if you're going to own your data, how are you going to own your data? That's the other side of it. And one way to own your data is to use the tools that you normally would use to integrate apps and processes and workflows and things like that. Use that same infrastructure to create the insulation layer. And so if you could imagine, using Zapier to populate a Google Sheet, which isn't really a file, it can be a file. It has the potential to be a file. So it's potential energy of file over app. But if you use these kind of glue factory systems like Zapier to work in your favor so that you are creating that insulation layer, I think that makes a lot of sense. I haven't really written much about that or thought much about it, but I think, all of us are getting pretty good with these glue systems, right? The ability to automate information movement. Maybe we should just do a little more automation of information that moves into a purview that we have better control over, that would allow us to recover from evaporation of a SaaS.
Lightning round, what I'm distilling and also would back up here too with my own experiences. There's a difference between platforms that allow you to sync directly to your desktop or platforms that give you like SLAs that give you ownership. So Dropbox, Google Drive, OneDrive, these are still cloud software services, but they integrate more gently and kindly with the idea that you actually can have and own your own apps. And then there are SaaS platforms like, we've talked about Notion, Coda, and Airtable, where all of the information you put in that platform is on their servers. They own it. And there's no native way for you to really own a core file. And we have a preference for creating connections between these two types of platforms so that you can back up your information in a file. So key takeaway there. And then I noticed we have a question or a hand raised from Troy. Troy, would you like to pop on your mic and then just kind of share with us what you're thinking?
Yeah, Bill, you had mentioned, failing over if you have an outage or if Coda goes down, you have a way. A couple things. One is I think that's actually something I think most people that do back up their stuff don't think about. Like, it's one thing to have the bits and the bytes and the context and the rows inserted in another system. It's another thing to actually continuity of business to keep your business running if there is an outage. So yes, I have this big pile of stuff from Coda and all these other services, and now they actually went down and they ran out of business, and I have all this stuff now. Now I've got to, but that's one thing. But secondly, I think the other thing to think about too, related to that is, we're not just, you mentioned the glue services. We're not just always just storing content, just documents, just text and images. Like, we have automations in Coda, we have webhooks in Coda, we have automations that connect from Coda to other systems. And if we don't have good documentation and processes around that, I think that's something to really think about, because if you don't have good processes, or good documentation around that, yes, you have the documents, but if you don't have all the other connections related to that, you're going to be in a herd of trouble trying to figure out where everything goes.
Spot on.
Absolutely.
It's catastrophic failure of your business when, Coda evaporates. Yeah, you've got the data, you've got, potentially all the canvases, you could reassemble them in another environment. But Doug has been really, clear about the amount of time and effort that it takes to recover from that. Imagine doing it without the data. So, that we're basically following, the worst case scenario and trying to make the worst case scenario not as worse as it could be. But I totally get it. It's a huge catastrophic issue that businesses, they won't be able to recover in some cases. I think Doug says, plan on 90 days.
No, that was someone else thinking that was more than enough, and I'm saying forget about it.
Yeah,
And
it's probably not.
Troy has really hit on a point. Clients really don't want to pay for that dirty word documentation. But, try to figure out how some automation you wrote 2 years ago worked. Now that you have to recreate it in some other system.
Yeah.
How does that webhook work? I mean,
well, this is
documented.
This is the problem of putting business logic in Zapier. If you plow enough business logic into Zapier, your team will be just as dumb as a post. They'll have no idea how their business works, right? Now, there's some tools like Operator and some of the others that are coming along to try to help you understand what that business logic is, but it is a continual push of business logic into a world that's fragmented. And the more fragmented it is, the more difficult it is to recover and reassemble in another environment. So, these are tough parts.
I feel like those are little landmines we just touched on with Zapier, and then even Operator AI, because we really haven't talked about what AI changes in this world, what data management and stuff like that. But I think you're right. If you put enough information into Zapier to automate enough business processes, right? The moment it goes down, your business comes to screeching halt, and there's no manual thing to make it work. I've seen where organizations may invest into writing SOPs, which the SOPs tickle me because they're not really SOPs. They're a bunch of how-to docs that tell you what to click and where, right? They don't really describe why this process matters, what's dependent on this process, who are the real who's and owners of the different parts of this process, and what the output of a certain procedure should really be. So that if you have higher skilled people, they can fill in the gaps, regardless of the tool, right? Sometimes there are processes that are naturally dependent on tools. And there are other things that should work no matter what tools we employ. And that is a level of like nuance and care I don't even see in a lot of documentation to begin with. So from that perspective, what, I mean, if we are using Zapier, or let's say I'm creating AI agents and all these automations, or I'm using Relay app or something else, like now we have business processes, not just data, but actual processes are now in the cloud. What do we do with that?
It's a difficult environment. The other thing too that it probably bears noting, when I try to think about insulation using file over app, I'm not thinking only about files. I'm thinking about tools that actually run at the desktop. So, there's been a push since the late 90s to get away from, early binding of application processes at the desktop, installable apps, things like that. We've kind of escaped from that because the SaaS environment gives us so many benefits to do so. And in the process of doing that, we've kind of lost that love and feeling for an app that just runs on the desktop, works on the desktop, uses files on the desktop. It's completely independent. In fact, you can air gap your laptop and do your work. Nobody gives a shit. And so that kind of relationship with computing devices probably makes some sense. We see it in phones now. You can go into airplane mode and still work on certain apps. Not all the apps work that way, but many do. And so there is kind of, I think, a movement to try to distance ourselves from those tools that only work with cloud. And so the file over app philosophy would say, try to seek out ways that you can work with your data without requiring any connectivity whatsoever. Obviously, when you get into Teams, there has to be some kind of a rewind or a resync when you are connected at some point. But that still doesn't rule out the possibility that a really good desktop app can run independent and still work in a Teams environment. I think it just requires, better architecture, better tools, et cetera. So
There used to be
I
something
don't
called
rule that out.
There used to be something called networks, and you and your code just worked on your network.
Yeah.
And I have to say, the lawyer in me often wonders about, so the subpoena shows up at Coda to get the information on the client that's buried up in Coda. And, if they can figure out how to get it out of Coda, they can probably get it, and I can't stop that. And we occasionally have information that, we have one client who has like screen things on their windows so that no one can see what you're doing on your desktop.
Right, but
you don't want the financial information to be scarfed off.
But that doesn't change just because you have a third-party SaaS relationship, right? Because a subpoena can penetrate your own laptop sitting in your own office as well.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, absolutely.
Right.
What I'm worried about is somebody getting the data without me knowing about it.
Without you knowing, yeah, right. That's kind of a different problem, but it's still a SaaS risk, right?
I want to shift our conversation to some tactile, like what are recommendations and strategies? Previously, we've talked about the ability to take information from SaaS applications and copy them over, whether using Google App Scripts, Zapier, Make.com, Pipedream. These are platforms that are IP or they're doing API as a service, where you can actually make those queries and dump them into a file format that is useful for you offline. My favorite, of course, is going to be CSV and Markdown. In fact, I have anchored my business now to a tool called Fibery, partially because of its ability to export all rich text fields as Markdown directly in the API. No translation, no third-party application needed. It's just always ready and easy to jump. So are there platforms, Bill, Doug, and even Blessing, that you would say, this platform makes it pretty easy for you to move data in and out when you're thinking of creating business redundancies? And which ones?
Okay, so there was a question that just popped up. Was it from Nick?
Yeah, Nick wants us to work for this.
What's that? Let's see.
Continue with
I'll
what
look
you
at
were
it.
chatting about. But
I gotta read it out loud for everyone. So he said, don't you
Yeah.
run into some of the same obsolescence problems when running local and storing local? Some open source app that you rely on for business processes stops being maintained becomes insecure or incompatible with, you know, your operating system. And so in that case, like, does that stuff just tend to happen slower? Giving you more time to transition.
Yeah, no, it's
I
a
mean, that
risk.
is it.
It's definitely a risk. But one thing about that risk is that there's a little bit of a stopgap there, in that if you possess an app that runs on your desktop, even if that app is not being maintained and you still work with your data the same way you did before, you have some insulation there. You have the ability to continue on and at least limp as your business, you know, continues to run. And so there is some independence gained by that, but I agree, there's still some risk in that as well. And going back to Enoma's question, you know, what are some of the tips? I have a really good one. This is the one I live by. Build your systems, build your products, build your companies, and then sell them while the SaaS systems they depend on are flying high. Sell it, move on, repeat, rinse, repeat. That's the way to avoid this, right?
I mean, many a FileMaker shop has made millions, if not billions, in the ecosystem. And while there are many businesses that still use FileMaker today, we wouldn't say that it is at the height of usage, right? But you
No.
could say the same for NetSuite.
Sure.
You know, Nick, I just look at the time frame and I say desktop applications have a longer life cycle.
They
But
do.
operating systems have a longer life cycle. I am sure there is someone using Internet Explorer today who is a thorn in the side of Microsoft and Windows, but because it's a desktop application and they're probably running some version of I mean, like, people are still running Windows XP, right? If we're thinking about the global world. There is a slower dev and obsolescence cycle. And then consider file formatting as well. So .doc might be technically obsolete, but almost every platform that does word processing can support it. Even though we are over 15 years in on .docx. There is a tangibility to desktop and file running applications and platforms that you don't have to have when you're on a cloud server or service. I do commend Evernote for being one of the only true cloud syncing platforms that really did bridge the gap between desktop and cloud and do their best. They did a really good job of it while they attempted to do it. And now they've completely gone cloud, of actually catering to people who wanted both the flexibility of being offline and the comfort of syncing across multiple applications, it was Linux friendly, Windows, Apple, mobile device, tablet, covered all of the bases. We don't see any company even trying, even Dropbox and maybe even Box.com. They have continually removed some of the functionality that makes it friendly for you to sync directly to your desktop and navigate it online. They've shifted more online over the years. So
You
we're
wouldn't put Obsidian up there with
I
Evernote?
tried Obsidian. Honestly, let's just get real practical with Obsidian and that swell of tools. There are a number of tools in the dev friendly, like the engineer, technical, analytical friendly world of tools that make sense. Like we mentioned Markdown, and if I take Markdown to a business user, they just squirm. They're just, what is this? And I tried and it does not work. And so I think Obsidian is one of those that is great, but there is this like technical cliff. Tana is one that I recently tried as well. There is this technical cliff that people really end up having to dive into for the sake of, I want to own my data and yet have the benefits of cloud at the same time.
Yeah.
And I tried Obsidian recently. Then I went to Tana thinking it would work, and then realized I'm not going to invest as like a technically an agency of 1.5 that sometimes grows to maybe be like 3 or 4 if I count vendors and contractors. None of them are tech proficient like me, right? I refuse to invest in Tana practically because I don't have the time to teach you to ramp up. And Tana takes a very different paradigm that isn't necessarily Markdown friendly or even similar to like Notion blocks that we're used to seeing. It's such a different paradigm that you weigh that risk. And so practically what I've done recently is that I went back to Bear. Bear is an app that does Markdown. I don't know about their Windows support. I don't know if it exists, but I'm an Apple user in the Apple ecosystem. And Bear works really well for me. It is a note system that you can create notes on, but because they have integration with Apple Shortcuts and the whole URL callback system, I've built some automations around it. So one thing I do, I pair Bear with Cleft. Cleft is another AI tool that will take your voice dictations and transcribe it. Why I like Cleft is because on their desktop app, you can set it up to save your transcriptions and their AI generated notes directly to your hard drive because they have an Obsidian support feature, which really should just be saved to desktop. And so it goes to my desktop, and then using Hazel, it reads that file and reads the labels on this transcription. So I'll say, hey, this is me just doing my morning dictation, right? I will label it, Hazel will see that, and then it sends it to Relay app, which is like Zapier, to then run AI processing on it. Actually, I think for that I use Pipedream. We use Pipedream to do all the AI processing, and then it sends it back to my machine by way of Google. This is like a lot of loops, by the way, I'm aware. Sends it back to my machine, so that way I can put it back into Bear. I know Nick is cracking up. Put it back into Bear so I can have the result in the output, right? Nuts. And then I realized if I'm using Pipedream and it can respond, I can cut out Google Drive and just, I have a bash script that does it essentially. Now it just sends the API call, gets the response, saves it back to my hard drive, and we cut out a number of all the other things. But like, I'm still bending over backwards to get
I'm really
my
technical
tools to work.
and you lost me at bash script.
See, I have
I'm
a whole
nodding.
little mini program to simply take the data that I use in one app to transcribe, to take it, run it through AI and do a job, bring it back to me.
Yeah.
And then put it back inside the app that I really want it in.
And that's a very insulated file over app description, right? I mean, you're fundamentally, you could take your laptop and go anywhere and work right now, right?
I mean, even as an integrator of platforms, and I was able to follow the whole journey, I initially just thought to myself, I would rather just have the AI live on my desktop.
That's
Like,
what I'm
Well,
doing now. I'm updating my system.
That's a good
and-
that's a good segue. So I stopped taking notes. I don't take notes anymore. My notes are just a function of everything I say, see, do, type in any app, anytime, anywhere on my desktop. And by desktop, I mean a laptop that happens to be at a desk or happens to be in an airport. And the way that I
Okay.
do that is I simply record everything. So every half second, there's a screenshot. All audio that comes through the mic is recorded. Everything's recorded and then subjected to an on-device AI. And the
Are you using
on-device AI,
Rewind?
pardon me?
Are you using Rewind? Which does
No,
something like that?
no, I'm using ScreenPipe, an open
Mm.
source. It's kind of like Rewind. But I mean, Rewind is a pretty good idea. I think it's illegal in 11 states. But there's 11 states that are kind of in the nanny state category of two-party conversations. So any
Yeah.
recordings that occur fall under that two-party conversation rule. And so 11 states are in that realm. And I
Wow.
tend to ignore them because, as my wife says, it's nice being married to a felon who commits crimes every day.
Wow.
So
We get
I'm
along.
sure
Anyway.
I'm sure I'm committing a felony right now. I just don't know which one. That's the problem. But
You can't even enjoy it.
I can
No,
do it. Honestly, at this point, run for president.
I enjoy just being an unknown felon, so to speak. Hopefully, I'll never be discovered. But the idea that we have to take notes is one that I've always kind of resisted, because it's very similar. I think of it akin to classifying email messages in folders. Do you all remember when we used to do that? Most of you probably don't. But in the late 90s, there was a thing called dragging your emails into folders. And you created a taxonomy that hopefully gave you a leg up on your knowledge management, your personal knowledge management. And this became a thing in the late 90s and through the early 2000s. And then Gmail was announced. oddly on April Fool's Day of 2004. And on that day, I dumped all of my email from the late 80s all the way through 2004, which was mostly done in Outlook, into Gmail. And then I stopped organizing email. I became an email searcher. And so the same thing is happening to me now with regard to note taking. I don't use a note taker. I've used Obsidian, I've used Coda, I've used everything under the sun, because I'm one of those people that like to really just explore. But at the end of the day, everything I do on my computer is recorded. And if I need to synthesize some notes about my day, I use an AI to do that for me. And some days I don't need to synthesize notes. It's a lot of note taking is really about, it's more about sense making, right? We take notes so we can make sense of stuff. We don't take notes for pretty much any other reason that I can think of. I'm sure somebody could educate me, and I'd have a tough time debating it. But at the end of the day, I want to accomplish tasks. Tasks tend to work better if you have notes. Notes tend to work better if they're detailed. And what do humans do? We abstract our notes and we make them not detail. By definition, a note is not detail. And so I tried to escape from that by saying, wow, if you just recorded everything and you had a multimodal AI model that was able to see all of the frames in a video, like this video here, and dissect exactly who is saying what, when they said it, what context did they say it in, then I think I have a better chance of getting my tasks done as it pertains to this context. So that's kind of the direction that I'm heading. And all of it is file over app. None of that kind of process occurs anywhere except on my air-gapped, my potentially air-gapped laptop.
All right. Well, I feel like, as always, we end on some incredibly provocative topic that wasn't where we started. I feel like this is a segue. We need a future conversation on, like, what is the purpose of note taking and what makes it effective? And I'm a staunch believer in note taking. So this is, again, though, we keep doing this with each other.
Yes. If we do the one on note taking, first, I'm taking every corporate team to task who always wants a recording, but nobody ever watches it, reads it, looks at the notes. We need to have a whole moment about what is the purpose of corporate recording. But anyways.
Yeah. Employing it that's another, 2-hour podcast, I think. But I must also disclaim everything that I've said, because I come up with some really bad ideas and they don't all pan out. This one so far is panning out for me. I've been running circles around my team concerning who said what, when did they say it, and why did they say it. And I'm doing that because I have 100% of everything they typed, everything I typed, everything they said, what I said, and I have an AI that can sift through that very, very quickly. So I think I'm on to something, and it's really, ScreenPipe. The guys at ScreenPipe are kind of going down this path. So they're helping me commit this felony.
You have a new name.
I want to thank Bill for saying all that, because I learned to take shorthand in law school so I could take notes, ended up typing myself into oblivion every day. I still use the shorthand. I waste tons of time then dictating the shorthand to write the memo. And as you put it out, by the time I get done with all that, I've blown half the day. And what I really needed, that secret password or whatever, that isn't in there. And so you've just saved me from tons of Presbyterian guilt. And I want to say that I truly appreciate it.
Yes.
You're welcome, Doug. And my goal, if all I do is save one old guy from carpal tunnel, I'm good.
Experienced.
Experience. No.
Well, thank you, everybody. We really appreciate you joining us for our lunch hacker hour today. I take it we're going to be back here with some of the same usual suspects, but on the topic of note taking in the near future. So please do fill out the Luma survey. If you receive it, give us some feedback from today's session, and we will see you guys in a month.
Yes.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank y'all.